Good evening, dear friend. Come now, settle yourself gently into comfort and let the burdens of the day fall away like petals drifting from a flower. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about endings and attempted beginnings, about a man who had dominated Europe for more than a decade and who found himself suddenly removed from power, sent to rule a small island in the Mediterranean, and about how that exile would prove to be only an interlude rather than a conclusion. As you rest here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and steadily, let yourself drift back through time with me, back to the spring of 1814, when Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, faced the collapse of everything he had built and the necessity of accepting defeat at the hands of the coalition powers that had finally overcome his military genius. The months leading to Napoleon's first abdication had been a time of mounting crisis and desperation. Coalition armies had invaded France from multiple directions following the catastrophic Russian campaign of 1812 and the defeat at Leipzig in 1813. Napoleon had fought a brilliant defensive campaign through the winter and early spring of 1814, winning tactical victories against portions of the coalition forces and demonstrating that his military abilities remained formidable even in desperate circumstances. But these tactical successes could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that France faced overwhelming force, that French resources were exhausted after more than 2 decades of continuous warfare, and that French political and military support for continued fighting was eroding as the costs of Napoleon's ambitions became impossible to ignore. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the scene in early April 1814 when Napoleon, headquartered at Fontainebleau south of Paris, learned that coalition forces had entered Paris and that key military and political figures had abandoned him. Marshal Marmont, one of Napoleon's oldest associates, had defected with his troops to the coalition side. The Senate in Paris, influenced by the skillful diplomacy of French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who had secretly been working with the coalition powers, had declared Napoleon deposed and had invited the Bourbon monarchy to return. Napoleon's attempts to rally his remaining forces and continue the war met with refusal from his marshals, who told him bluntly that the army would not follow him, that France needed peace, and that his continued rule would only prolong suffering without changing the ultimate outcome. The abdication that Napoleon signed on April 6, 1814 was conditional, initially stating that he abdicated in favor of his son, the King of Rome, who would rule under a regency. But the coalition powers rejected this arrangement, insisting on unconditional abdication and on Napoleon's complete removal from French political life. On April 11th, Napoleon signed an unconditional abdication, ending his rule as Emperor of the French. The treaty negotiated between Napoleon and the coalition powers, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, granted him sovereignty over the island of Elba, located off the coast of Tuscany in the Mediterranean. He would retain the title of emperor, though now his empire consisted of an island about 86 square miles in area with a population of 12,000. He would receive an annual pension from the French government, and his wife Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, and their son would be granted the Duchy of Parma. The selection of Elba as Napoleon's place of exile reflected several calculations by the coalition powers. The island was close enough to Italy and to France that Napoleon could maintain some contact with the European political world and could receive news about developments. This proximity was intended partly as a kindness, allowing Napoleon to remain within the European sphere rather than being sent to some distant location. But the island was also small enough and isolated enough that Napoleon's ability to influence events would be severely limited. He would be under informal surveillance by coalition naval forces and by the Italian states that surrounded Elba's waters. The arrangement was meant to provide Napoleon with dignity while ensuring that he could no longer threaten the peace that the coalition powers were working to establish. Napoleon's journey to Elba in late April 1814 was both humiliating and dangerous. As he traveled south through France accompanied by a small escort of Allied commissioners, he encountered hostile demonstrations in some towns where French people blamed him for the years of warfare and suffering. In some locations, he had to travel in disguise to avoid potential violence from angry crowds. The man who had been cheered by millions and whose presence had inspired soldiers to perform extraordinary feats now faced the hatred of some of his former subjects who saw him as responsible for their losses and hardships. The contrast between his past glory and his present humiliation must have been almost unbearable for someone of Napoleon's pride and ambition. Upon arriving at Elba in early May 1814, Napoleon threw himself into the task of ruling his tiny domain with the same energy that he had brought to governing France and its empire. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, imagine Napoleon on Elba, establishing his court, organizing the island's administration, planning public works including roads and fortifications, reviewing the small garrison of soldiers that had accompanied him into exile. He toured the island, inspected its iron mines, concerned himself with agriculture and commerce, and attempted to improve the lives of his new subjects. This activity served partly to occupy his mind and to give him purpose, but it also reflected his nature. Napoleon was not someone who could accept passive retirement. He needed to act, to command, to shape events even when the scope for action had been reduced to a tiny Mediterranean island. But Napoleon also maintained contact with the larger European world from which he had been removed. He received visitors including his mother and his sister Pauline who came to Elba to keep him company. He maintained correspondence with supporters in France and elsewhere, learning about political developments and about the progress of the Congress of Vienna where European powers were meeting to reorganize the continent's political order. He received newspapers and reports that allowed him to follow events from which he was now excluded. And he pondered his situation, considering whether his exile to Elba would truly be permanent or whether circumstances might change in ways that could allow his return to power. Several developments during Napoleon's time on Elba troubled him and encouraged thoughts of return. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII proved unpopular with many segments of French society. Royalist émigrés who returned to France after decades of exile claimed back properties that had been confiscated during the Revolution, creating conflicts with current owners. The Bourbon government attempted to restore some features of the old regime that had been swept away by the Revolution, alienating many French people who had benefited from revolutionary changes. The army, in particular, resented the Bourbon restoration and the prominence given to royalist officers while Napoleonic veterans were retired or marginalized. The army remained loyal to Napoleon's memory and resentful of the regime that had replaced him. Napoleon also learned that the French government was not paying the pension that had been promised to him by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, leaving him in financial difficulties despite his modest imperial title. More troublingly, he heard rumors that the coalition powers were considering moving him from Elba to some more distant location, possibly Saint Helena, or another remote island where he would be completely isolated from European affairs. Whether these rumors were accurate or not, they created anxiety and may have influenced his decision-making about whether to accept his exile passively or to attempt something dramatic. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can sense how Napoleon's situation on Elba, while superficially comfortable, was also frustrating and uncertain. He retained the habits and instincts of power while possessing only a shadow of his former position. He followed European political developments while being unable to influence them. He maintained the routines of imperial dignity while ruling over an island that could barely support a modest household. The combination of wounded pride, political calculation, and genuine belief that France needed his leadership would eventually lead him to make the most audacious decision of his remarkable career, to escape from Elba and to attempt to reclaim his throne despite the opposition of all the major European powers. The coalition powers' mistake, in retrospect, was in placing Napoleon so close to Europe and in allowing him the resources and freedom of movement that made escape possible. Elba was watched but not closely guarded. Napoleon maintained his own small navy, including a brig that could cross to the Italian mainland in hours. Coalition surveillance was complacent, assuming that Napoleon understood the futility of attempting to return and that he would accept his exile. This complacency would prove costly when, in February 1815, Napoleon gathered a small force of loyal guardsmen and sailors, boarded ships, and sailed from Elba toward the French coast, beginning the extraordinary episode that would become known as the 100 Days. While Napoleon lived in exile on Elba during the latter half of 1814, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, the victorious coalition powers gathered in Vienna to undertake the enormous task of reconstructing European political order after more than 2 decades of revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval. The Congress of Vienna, which opened in September 1814 and would continue with interruptions into 1815, brought together representatives of virtually every European state, from the great powers who had defeated Napoleon to the smallest German principalities whose territories had been reorganized during the Napoleonic period. This was diplomacy on an unprecedented scale, attempting to address countless territorial disputes, dynastic questions, balance of power issues, and principles of international order. The Congress was dominated by the representatives of the 4 major coalition powers that had defeated France, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. Each power sent its most skilled diplomat or statesman to represent its interests. Britain was represented by Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, a pragmatic conservative who sought to create a European balance of power that would prevent future French aggression while not humiliating France so completely that it would inevitably seek revenge. Austria was represented by Foreign Minister Prince Clemens von Metternich, who would emerge as perhaps the most influential figure at the Congress, advocating for principles of legitimacy and conservative order that would restore traditional monarchies and suppress revolutionary and nationalist movements that threatened the established order. Russia sent Tsar Alexander I himself, the autocratic ruler who had led his country's resistance to Napoleon and who now sought recognition of Russian power and influence in European affairs. Alexander was a complex figure, combining autocratic instincts with occasionally liberal rhetoric, religious mysticism with great power ambitions. His vision for post-war Europe included significant Russian influence in Poland and in other border regions, making him both an essential partner in the coalition and a potential threat to Austrian and British interests if Russian power expanded too far westward. Prussia was represented by Chancellor Karl August von Hardenberg, seeking to restore and enhance Prussian power that had been so humiliated by the catastrophic defeats of 1806. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the atmosphere in Vienna during the Congress, which combined serious diplomatic negotiation with elaborate social activities including balls, concerts, and theatrical performances. The city became the center of European high society for months, with hundreds of diplomats, ministers, nobles, and hangers-on participating in both the official work of the Congress and in the extensive entertainment that accompanied it. The phrase "the Congress dances" captured this combination of serious political work and lavish socializing, suggesting both the importance of informal social networks in facilitating diplomatic agreements and the contrast between the glittering social life of Vienna and the serious business of redrawing Europe's political map. The Congress operated on several guiding principles, though these were sometimes in tension with each other and were applied selectively depending on the interests of the major powers. The principle of legitimacy, favored particularly by Metternich, held that traditional monarchies that had been displaced by revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval should be restored to their thrones. This principle led to restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France, of various Italian dynasties displaced by French conquest, and of smaller German rulers who had lost their territories. But legitimacy was balanced against the principle of balance of power, which sometimes required territorial adjustments that contradicted strict legitimacy. And both principles had to accommodate the principle of compensation, by which powers that had fought in the coalition expected territorial gains to reward their sacrifices and to strengthen their positions. The territorial settlement that emerged from the Congress of Vienna involved countless detailed negotiations and compromises. Some of the major elements included the creation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, combining the former Dutch Republic with the Austrian Netherlands, or Belgium, to create a stronger buffer state against potential future French expansion northward. This consolidation created a more substantial power on France's northeastern border than had existed before. In Germany, the Congress created the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 German states that replaced the defunct Holy Roman Empire. Austria and Prussia were both members of the Confederation and competed for influence within it, but the Confederation itself had limited powers and was primarily a framework for coordinating some common policies while preserving the independence of member states. The Polish question proved particularly contentious, as Russia had gained control of much of Polish territory during the wars, and Alexander I insisted on maintaining that control. The other powers, particularly Austria and Britain, worried about Russian power expanding so far westward and about the implications for the European balance of power. The compromise that eventually emerged created a Congress Poland nominally independent but with Alexander as its king and with Russian forces occupying it, effectively making Poland a Russian satellite. Prussia received compensation in the form of territories in Western Germany, including the Rhineland and Westphalia, strengthening Prussian presence in Western Germany and creating Prussian interest in defending these territories against France. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the Congress of Vienna attempted to create a European order that would be stable and lasting, that would prevent any single power from achieving the kind of dominance that France had achieved under Napoleon, and that would provide mechanisms for great power cooperation in managing European affairs. The Concert of Europe, the system of regular consultation and cooperation among the major powers that emerged from the Congress, was meant to address disputes through negotiation rather than through war, and to coordinate responses to threats to the established order, including revolutionary movements and nationalist agitations. The treatment of France in the Vienna settlement reflected careful calculation about how to integrate a defeated aggressor back into the European system. The initial Treaty of Paris in May 1814 had been relatively lenient, allowing France to retain its traditional pre-revolutionary borders and not imposing harsh reparations or prolonged occupation. This leniency reflected recognition that France remained a major European power that would need to be accommodated rather than permanently weakened and embittered. But it also reflected the fact that the coalition was dealing with the restored Bourbon monarchy rather than with Napoleon, allowing the coalition to present the settlement as punishing Napoleon's aggression while welcoming France back into the community of European monarchies. Talleyrand, representing France at the Congress despite France's status as defeated power, proved remarkably skilled at exploiting divisions among the victorious powers and at positioning France as a necessary partner in maintaining European balance. He advocated loudly for the principle of legitimacy, which served Bourbon interests, and he worked to moderate the territorial ambitions of the victorious powers by encouraging suspicions among them and by positioning France as a balancing factor. By the time the Congress completed its work, France had been substantially reintegrated into European diplomatic society and had avoided the kind of punitive peace that might have been imposed on a defeated aggressor. The Congress's work was interrupted dramatically in March 1815 when news arrived that Napoleon had escaped from Elba and had returned to France. This development forced the Congress participants to suspend their territorial negotiations and to focus on the immediate threat of Napoleonic restoration. The coalition powers quickly declared Napoleon an outlaw, proclaimed their determination to remove him by force, and began mobilizing armies to invade France. But before military operations could commence, the Congress participants wanted to formalize their alliance and their commitment to defeating Napoleon and to preventing any future French aggression. The result was the treaty signed on March 25, 1815, renewing and strengthening the alliance among Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. Each power agreed to provide substantial military forces, 150,000 men each, for operations against France. They committed to remaining at war until Napoleon was definitively defeated and removed from power. And they pledged to maintain their alliance after Napoleon's defeat to ensure that France remained contained and that the European order they were creating would be defended against future threats. This alliance represented an unprecedented level of great power cooperation and commitment, demonstrating that the coalition had learned from the difficulties of previous coalitions and was determined not to allow Napoleon any possibility of exploiting divisions among his enemies. On February 26, 1815, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, Napoleon Bonaparte departed the island of Elba with approximately 1,000 soldiers of his old guard and a small flotilla of vessels, sailing north across the Mediterranean toward the French coast. This escape had been planned carefully over several weeks, with Napoleon gathering supplies, preparing his ships, and timing his departure to avoid detection by British and French naval vessels that occasionally patrolled near Elba. The audacity of this venture was extraordinary. Napoleon was attempting to reclaim the throne of France despite being opposed by all the major European powers, despite having no assurances of support from the French military or political establishment, and despite the enormous military and diplomatic obstacles that stood between him and restoration of his empire. The crossing from Elba to the French coast took 3 days, with Napoleon's small flotilla sailing north through waters where they might have been intercepted by naval vessels of any of the powers that would oppose Napoleon's return. But fortune favored the escape, and Napoleon's ships reached the French coast near Antibes on the 1st of March without incident. From there, Napoleon began a march northward toward Paris, following a route through the Alps and through the mountainous regions of southeastern France where he hoped to avoid concentrations of royalist troops and where the population might be more sympathetic to his return. The first days of Napoleon's march were uncertain and tense. When he attempted to enter the town of Antibes, the garrison refused to open the gates and even fired on his troops. Napoleon had to bypass the town and continue his march with supplies that were limited and with no assurance that other French military units would receive him more favorably. But as the march continued northward, the situation changed dramatically. At the town of Grenoble, a significant military garrison had been sent to oppose Napoleon's advance and to arrest him. The royalist officers commanding these troops had assured their superiors that their men would fire on Napoleon if necessary and would prevent his advance. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the moment when Napoleon, informed that troops blocked his path near Grenoble, walked forward alone to confront them. He approached to within speaking distance of the soldiers, many of whom had served under him in earlier campaigns, and he opened his coat, exposing his chest, and called out to them. He reminded them of their shared service, of the battles they had fought together, of the glory they had won under his leadership. He asked if any of them wanted to shoot their emperor. The effect was electric. The soldiers, rather than firing on Napoleon or arresting him, broke ranks and rushed forward to embrace him, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" Their officers' authority dissolved instantly, and the troops who had been sent to stop Napoleon instead joined him. This scene would repeat itself again and again as Napoleon advanced northward toward Paris. Royalist troops sent to oppose him defected to his side, bringing their arms and equipment with them. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most famous commanders who had sworn loyalty to Louis XVIII and who had been sent to capture Napoleon, instead joined him after meeting with Napoleon and being reminded of their shared history. Each defection brought more troops to Napoleon's growing force and demonstrated to observers that the French army's loyalty remained with Napoleon rather than with the restored Bourbon monarchy. The speed and completeness of the military defections shocked both the Bourbon government and the European powers, revealing the weakness of Louis XVIII's position and the strength of Napoleon's hold on French military loyalty. Louis XVIII, informed of Napoleon's landing and then of the defections that were allowing Napoleon to advance unopposed, attempted to rally support in Paris and to organize military resistance. But confidence in the Bourbon regime was evaporating as news arrived of one defection after another. On March 19, as Napoleon approached Paris from the south, Louis XVIII quietly departed the capital, fleeing north toward the Austrian Netherlands and toward the protection of coalition forces. That evening, Napoleon entered Paris and took up residence in the Tuileries Palace, reclaiming the throne without a shot being fired in his defense or opposition. The Bourbon monarchy had collapsed in the face of Napoleon's return, and France once again had an emperor. The 100 Days, as this period would come to be called, though it actually lasted slightly longer than 100 days from Napoleon's return to his final abdication, represented a remarkable but ultimately doomed attempt to restore Napoleonic power. Napoleon understood immediately that his international position was desperate. The coalition powers had declared him an outlaw and were mobilizing overwhelming military force to invade France and remove him. He could not hope to defeat the combined might of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia through prolonged warfare. His only hope was to achieve quick military victories that might divide the coalition or convince some powers that accepting his restoration was less costly than continuing the war. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate Napoleon's situation in late March and April 1815. He had successfully reclaimed his throne through the loyalty of the French army and through the weakness of the Bourbon Restoration, but he now faced a diplomatic and strategic position far worse than any he had confronted in earlier phases of his career. Every major European power was committed to his removal. No power would negotiate with him or accept his restoration. The coalition had learned from earlier wars not to fight Napoleon piecemeal but to coordinate operations and to use their overwhelming numerical superiority. And France itself was exhausted from decades of warfare, unable to support the kind of total military mobilization that had sustained earlier French efforts. Napoleon's domestic political situation during the 100 Days was also complex. While the army welcomed his return and while many French people preferred Napoleon to the Bourbons, there was also widespread desire for peace and concern about renewed warfare. Napoleon attempted to address these concerns by presenting himself as a changed man, no longer the autocratic emperor but a constitutional monarch who would govern with liberal institutions and respect for popular sovereignty. He issued a constitutional document called the Additional Act that promised civil liberties, representative institutions, and limits on imperial power. This liberal turn was partly genuine, reflecting Napoleon's recognition that he needed popular support, but it was also tactical, attempting to appeal to liberal opinion in France and abroad and to distinguish his restored empire from the authoritarian regime he had led before 1814. But constitutional reforms could not change the fundamental reality that Napoleon faced. The coalition was determined to remove him, and military force would decide the outcome. Napoleon spent April and May 1815 frantically preparing France for war, calling up conscripts, organizing armies, stockpiling supplies, and planning campaigns. He assembled approximately 200,000 troops, respectable in number but composed largely of raw recruits rather than experienced veterans. The quality of this force was far below that of the Grande Army that had dominated Europe in earlier years. Against these French forces, the coalition was mobilizing more than 1 million men from the armies of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, though these forces would take time to concentrate and to move into position for operations against France. Napoleon's strategic situation required him to act before the coalition could bring its overwhelming force to bear. Coalition armies were assembling on France's borders but were not yet ready for coordinated offensive operations. A British-Dutch army under the Duke of Wellington was in Belgium. A Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher was also in Belgium. Austrian armies were mobilizing in Germany and northern Italy. Russian forces were marching westward from Russia but would not reach the theater for months. Napoleon's plan was to strike at the British and Prussian armies in Belgium before they could unite and before Austrian and Russian forces could join them, hoping to defeat them separately and thereby to convince the coalition that continuing the war would be too costly. During April and May 1815, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, Napoleon worked with desperate energy to prepare France for the coming conflict while also attempting, through diplomacy and propaganda, to create any possible divisions among the coalition powers or to delay their operations long enough for him to achieve military success. These efforts at diplomacy were probably futile given the coalition's firm determination to remove him, but Napoleon had to try every possible avenue, and there remained some slight possibility that military success might change political calculations. Napoleon sent communications to the European powers attempting to justify his return and to argue that France posed no threat to European peace, that he sought only to govern France under a constitutional system, and that the coalition's continued hostility was unjustified. These messages received no substantive response. The coalition powers had declared Napoleon an outlaw under international law, had proclaimed that no peace was possible while he remained in power, and had committed themselves publicly and formally to his removal by military force. Even had some coalition leaders been tempted to negotiate, which they were not, their formal commitments and the political necessity of maintaining coalition unity made such negotiations impossible. Within France, Napoleon attempted to build political support and to mobilize popular enthusiasm for his restored rule. He toured military units, reviewing troops and inspiring soldiers with his presence and his rhetoric. He held ceremonies in Paris including a dramatic assembly on the Champ de Mars where hundreds of thousands of Parisians gathered to demonstrate their support for the emperor and for France. These events were partly genuine expressions of popular sentiment and partly staged propaganda designed to show France united behind Napoleon and willing to defend against coalition invasion. The reality was more complex, with French opinion divided between those who welcomed Napoleon's return, those who preferred the Bourbons despite their unpopularity, and those who simply wanted peace regardless of who governed. The additional act, Napoleon's constitutional reform document promulgated in April 1815, represented an attempt to present his restored empire as fundamentally different from his earlier autocratic rule. The document promised representative institutions including an elected Chamber of Deputies, protection of civil liberties including freedom of press and freedom of speech, and constraints on imperial power through constitutional procedures. Whether Napoleon genuinely intended to govern under these liberal constraints or whether this was a tactical maneuver to build support is historically debated. His earlier career showed little commitment to constitutional limits on his power, but the circumstances of his return and his need for popular and liberal support may have convinced him that some degree of constitutional governance was necessary. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the internal tensions within France during these months. The country had experienced more than 2 decades of revolutionary upheaval and Napoleonic warfare, had suffered enormous casualties and economic disruption, had been invaded and occupied just a year earlier, and now faced the prospect of renewed war against overwhelming coalition force. Many French people were exhausted, wanted peace, and feared that Napoleon's return would bring only more suffering. But the army remained largely loyal to Napoleon. The Bourbon Restoration had been unpopular with many groups including veterans and those who had benefited from revolutionary reforms, and French national pride was offended by the coalition's high-handed treatment of France and its determination to dictate who could rule the country. The royalist resistance in some parts of France, particularly in the Vendée region in western France where conservative Catholic peasants had resisted the revolution and remained loyal to the Bourbon monarchy, created security problems for Napoleon's government. Royalist uprisings had to be suppressed by military force, diverting troops that were needed for the armies preparing to face the coalition. The civil conflict, while limited in scale, demonstrated that Napoleon's return had not united France but had rather renewed divisions that the Bourbon Restoration had temporarily papered over. By late May 1815, Napoleon's preparations for military operations were as complete as circumstances allowed. He had assembled an army of the north totaling approximately 125,000 men, organized in army corps under commanders including Marshal Ney and Marshal Grouchy. This force was stationed in northern France, positioned to move quickly into Belgium where Wellington's British-Dutch army and Blücher's Prussian army were located at some distance from each other and not yet fully coordinated in their operations. Napoleon's plan was to move rapidly between the two enemy armies, preventing them from uniting, and to defeat them separately before they could concentrate their combined strength against him. The strategy had merit given Napoleon's inferior numbers and given the need to achieve quick results before Austrian and Russian forces could arrive to tip the numerical balance even more decisively against France. Napoleon's army, though smaller and less experienced than his earlier forces, was still capable of rapid movement and was under unified command, while the coalition forces in Belgium were divided between two separate armies under different commanders who had to coordinate their operations. If Napoleon could move quickly and surprise his enemies, he might achieve the kind of decisive victory that could change political calculations and that might convince some coalition powers that peace on terms allowing Napoleon to remain in power was preferable to continued costly warfare. The campaign would need to be executed with near-perfect timing and with the kind of operational brilliance that Napoleon had demonstrated in earlier campaigns. Any delay, any failure to achieve surprise, any inability to defeat one enemy army before the other could come to its support, would doom the campaign to failure. And even success in Belgium would not end the war, as Austrian and Russian armies would still be advancing and would still need to be confronted. But success in Belgium might buy time, might create diplomatic opportunities, and at minimum might allow Napoleon to negotiate from a position of some strength rather than facing inevitable defeat and removal. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense the desperation underlying Napoleon's strategy. He was gambling everything on a single campaign, on his ability to achieve the kind of spectacular military success that had characterized his earlier career, on the hope that coalition unity might crack under the strain of continued warfare, on the possibility that fortune might favor him one more time. But he was also operating under severe constraints including numerical inferiority, time pressure, exhaustion of French resources, and the determination of his enemies to accept no outcome other than his complete removal from power. On June 15, 1815, Napoleon's army crossed the French border into Belgium, beginning the campaign that would culminate at Waterloo 9 days later. The initial movement achieved the surprise that Napoleon sought, with French forces concentrating rapidly and moving between Wellington's and Blücher's armies before the coalition commanders fully understood what was happening. The campaign was underway, and the fate of Napoleon's empire and of European political order would be decided on the fields of Belgium over the next few days. In mid-June 1815, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, the stage was set for the final military confrontation between Napoleon and the coalition powers. The strategic situation was complex, with multiple armies positioned across Belgium and northeastern France, with questions of timing and coordination proving critical, and with the outcome having implications far beyond the immediate military results. Understanding this strategic context helps illuminate why the campaign unfolded as it did and why the battle that would be fought at Waterloo on June 18 represented Napoleon's last realistic opportunity to avoid complete defeat. The coalition forces in Belgium consisted of two main armies. Wellington commanded a mixed force of approximately 95,000 men, including British troops who were largely veterans of the Peninsular War against France in Spain and Portugal, but also including Dutch, Belgian, and German contingents of varying quality and reliability. This army was spread across western Belgium, with units stationed in various towns and with supply lines extending back to the coast where British naval power could provide logistical support. Wellington's army was designed to defend against French invasion from the south and to advance into France when combined coalition strength was ready for offensive operations. Blücher's Prussian army totaled approximately 120,000 men organized in 4 corps, positioned in central and eastern Belgium. The Prussian army was still recovering from the catastrophic defeats of 1806 and from the losses suffered in the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, but Prussian military reforms had created a more effective force, and Prussian determination to defeat Napoleon and to avenge earlier humiliations was strong. The Prussian army was also spread across considerable distance, with the different corps stationed in separate areas, requiring time and coordination to concentrate if faced with French attack. Wellington and Blücher had agreed in principle to coordinate their operations and to support each other if either army was attacked by Napoleon. But the practical implementation of this coordination was complicated by distance, by the limited speed of communications in 1815, which relied on messengers on horseback, and by the separate command structures with each commander responsible to his own government and making decisions based on his own assessment of the situation. The coalition strategy called for eventual union of all coalition forces, including Austrian and Russian armies, for a coordinated invasion of France, but in mid-June the Austrian and Russian forces were still weeks away from being ready for operations. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine Napoleon's analysis of this strategic situation as he prepared to launch his campaign in mid-June. His army was outnumbered by the combined British and Prussian forces, but those forces were separated and could potentially be defeated separately before they united. His army was concentrated and under unified command, giving him advantages in speed and coordination that the coalition forces lacked. His objective was not necessarily to destroy Wellington's and Blücher's armies completely, which would be difficult even if everything went according to plan, but rather to inflict sufficient defeats on them to force their withdrawal and to create political pressure within the coalition for peace negotiations. The opening of the campaign on June 15 went well for Napoleon. French forces crossed into Belgium and advanced rapidly northward, achieving surprise and moving between the British and Prussian armies before either could react effectively. By June 16, French forces had engaged both the Prussian army at Ligny and the British army at Quatre Bras, two battles fought simultaneously at locations about 10 miles apart. At Ligny, Napoleon commanded personally against the Prussian forces, achieving a tactical victory and forcing the Prussians to retreat with significant casualties. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney commanded French forces against Wellington's advance guard, fighting an inconclusive engagement that prevented Wellington from moving to support the Prussians, but that also did not achieve the decisive defeat of British forces that Napoleon had hoped for. The results of June 16 were mixed from Napoleon's perspective. He had achieved tactical success against the Prussians, inflicting casualties and forcing them to retreat. But he had not destroyed Blücher's army, which withdrew in reasonable order to the north rather than retreating eastward toward Prussia as Napoleon had hoped. The direction of the Prussian retreat meant that Blücher remained in a position where he could potentially support Wellington if another battle occurred. At Quatre Bras, Ney had failed to defeat Wellington's forces decisively, allowing Wellington to maintain his position and to continue coordinating with the Prussians. On June 17, as rain began to fall across Belgium, the situation evolved in ways that would prove crucial for the final battle. Wellington, learning of the Prussian retreat and recognizing that maintaining his position at Quatre Bras would expose him to being cut off from the Prussians, ordered his own army to retreat northward to a position he had previously scouted near the village of Waterloo. This position was about 10 miles south of Brussels on a low ridge that offered defensive advantages, with good visibility across the approaches and with the ability to position troops behind the ridge where they would be protected from French artillery fire. Wellington chose this position partly because it offered good defensive terrain and partly because it was close enough to where the Prussian army was located that Blücher could potentially march to support him if battle occurred there. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the campaign was converging toward a decisive confrontation. Napoleon had achieved some success in the first days, but he had not accomplished his objective of defeating the coalition armies separately before they could unite. Wellington and Blücher remained in contact, could coordinate their movements, and were both committed to standing and fighting rather than withdrawing further and allowing Napoleon to occupy Brussels and to claim political victory from military operations. The battle that would occur on June 18 would involve approximately 70,000 French troops facing initially about 67,000 British-Dutch troops under Wellington, with the question of whether and when Prussian forces could arrive to support Wellington proving critical to the battle's outcome. Napoleon's plan for the Battle of Waterloo, as it took shape on the evening of June 17 and the morning of June 18, was relatively straightforward given his numerical inferiority. He would attack Wellington's position frontally, using French artillery to weaken British defences and French infantry and cavalry to break through Wellington's line. If he could break Wellington's army and force it to retreat in disorder, he would claim victory even if the success was not complete, and he would then turn to deal with the Prussian forces if they attempted to intervene. The plan relied on achieving breakthrough before Prussian reinforcements could arrive in sufficient strength to change the battle's outcome. Wellington's defensive position was strong, with his army deployed along a ridge that provided natural defensive advantages. His infantry were positioned where they could fire down on attacking French forces while having some protection from artillery fire. His flanks were anchored on strong points including the farm complex of Hougoumont on his right and the farm of La Haye-Saint in his center. His strategy was to hold his position, to inflict casualties on attacking French forces, and to maintain his army's coherence until Prussian reinforcements could arrive. He had received assurances from Blücher that Prussian forces would march to his support, though the timing of their arrival was uncertain and would depend on the distance they had to march and on the condition of the roads after the heavy rain. Blücher's decision to march his army to support Wellington rather than retreating further eastward to protect his own lines of communication was crucial and demonstrated the coalition coordination that had been lacking in earlier wars against Napoleon. Blücher was willing to risk his army to support Wellington because he understood that defeating Napoleon required the coalition armies to work together, that allowing Napoleon to defeat them separately would lead to ultimate coalition failure, and that the political imperatives of maintaining coalition unity outweighed purely military calculations about protecting Prussian interests. This willingness to subordinate national interests to coalition objectives represented a level of strategic wisdom that had been absent in earlier coalitions. On the morning of June 18, 1815, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, the armies faced each other across the muddy fields near Waterloo, preparing for the battle that would determine Napoleon's fate and that would end his final attempt to reclaim his dominant position in European affairs. The ground was wet from heavy rain the previous night, which delayed the beginning of the battle until late morning as Napoleon waited for the ground to dry enough for his artillery to be moved into position and for cavalry operations to be feasible. This delay would prove consequential, as every hour that passed was an hour during which Prussian forces marched closer to the battlefield. Napoleon's plan was to open with a massive artillery bombardment to weaken Wellington's defensive position, followed by infantry attacks designed to break through the British line at its center or to force Wellington to weaken his center by committing reserves to defend his flanks. French artillery, positioned on a ridge facing Wellington's position, began firing around midday, sending round shot across the valley toward British positions. But Wellington had positioned most of his infantry on the reverse slope of the ridge he occupied, protecting them from direct artillery fire, limiting the effectiveness of the French bombardment that Napoleon had hoped would shatter British morale and create openings for infantry assault. The battle developed through several phases over the course of the afternoon and early evening. French attacks on Hougoumont, the fortified farm complex on Wellington's right flank, began early and continued throughout the day, drawing in substantial French forces in fighting that was intense but that did not achieve breakthrough or force Wellington to weaken his center significantly. In the center, French infantry launched major assaults against the British positions, achieving temporary success including capture of La Haye-Saint, the farm complex in the center of Wellington's position, but unable to exploit these local gains to break Wellington's overall defensive line. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the ebb and flow of the battle as French forces attacked repeatedly, achieving local successes but unable to break through decisively, while Wellington's forces defended stubbornly, suffering heavy casualties but maintaining the coherence of their defensive position. The British infantry, organized in squares to defend against French cavalry and in lines to deliver volley fire against French infantry, demonstrated the discipline and training that Wellington had developed during years of campaigning in the peninsula. The Dutch and Belgian troops in Wellington's army were less reliable, with some units breaking under French pressure, but British and German units held, and Wellington personally moved around the battlefield, positioning reserves to plug gaps and maintaining his soldiers' morale through his visible leadership. Marshal Ney, commanding French forces in the field as Napoleon observed from a position further back, made the controversial decision to launch large-scale cavalry attacks against Wellington's center and right in the middle of the afternoon, before the British infantry had been sufficiently weakened by artillery fire and infantry assault. These cavalry charges were spectacular but ultimately futile, as British infantry formed squares that cavalry could not break, and French horsemen charged repeatedly against these formations without achieving significant results. The cavalry attacks exhausted French mounted forces and inflicted casualties without gaining the breakthrough that might have allowed Napoleon to claim victory. Meanwhile, Prussian forces under Blücher were approaching the battlefield from the east, having marched since early morning from their position several miles away. The first Prussian units began arriving on the eastern edge of the battlefield in the early afternoon, and their numbers increased throughout the afternoon as more Prussian corps completed the march and deployed for combat. Napoleon was forced to detach substantial forces under Marshal Grouchy to protect his right flank and rear from the growing Prussian presence, reducing the forces available to attack Wellington and creating a situation where Napoleon faced two enemy armies simultaneously. The critical moment came in the early evening when Napoleon, recognizing that time was running out and that Prussian pressure on his right flank was growing unsustainable, committed his elite Imperial Guard in a final desperate attack against Wellington's center. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's best troops and his final reserve, advanced up the slope toward Wellington's position in a disciplined attack that represented Napoleon's last hope of breaking through. But Wellington's forces, strengthened by the arrival of fresh units that Wellington had been holding in reserve, delivered devastating fire into the advancing Guard, stopping the attack and forcing the Guard to retreat. This was the first time in memory that the Imperial Guard had been repulsed, and the sight of the Guard retreating shattered French morale across the battlefield. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense how the battle had reached its climax. Wellington's forces, exhausted but still maintaining their positions, began to advance as French forces started to give way. Prussian forces, now arriving in strength, attacked the French right flank, creating chaos in French positions and threatening to cut off French lines of retreat. The French army, which had fought courageously throughout the day, began to dissolve as units broke and soldiers fled southward in growing disorder. Napoleon attempted to rally his forces and to organize an orderly retreat, but the collapse was too complete, and the French army that had begun the day as an organized fighting force ended it as a disorganized mass of fugitives seeking escape. The casualties at Waterloo were severe on all sides. Wellington's British-Dutch army suffered approximately 15,000 casualties from a force of about 67,000, or roughly 22%. Prussian casualties were approximately 7,000 from the forces engaged. French casualties were even higher, with estimates ranging from 25,000 to 35,000, including not only those killed and wounded in the battle but also those captured during the retreat and those who simply scattered and never returned to organized French service. Beyond the casualties, the French army lost its cohesion and its capability to continue organized resistance, ending any possibility that Napoleon could continue the war. The Battle of Waterloo was not the largest or bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, but it was the most decisive in its political and strategic consequences. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo ended his 100 days and forced his second and final abdication. The battle demonstrated once again that coalition coordination and numerical superiority could overcome even Napoleon's tactical skill and his soldiers' courage. And it confirmed that the coalition powers were correct in their assessment that only Napoleon's permanent removal would bring lasting peace to Europe. The conduct of the battle has been analyzed and debated by military historians ever since, with endless discussion of what Napoleon might have done differently, whether his subordinates, particularly Ney and Grouchy, executed his plans adequately, whether earlier start to the battle or different tactical choices might have changed the outcome. But the fundamental reality was that Napoleon faced overwhelming strategic disadvantages. He was outnumbered, facing two armies that could support each other, fighting against enemies who had learned from years of experience how to counter his methods, and operating under time pressure because even victory at Waterloo would not end the war as Austrian and Russian armies were still advancing toward France. The battle's outcome was not foreordained, and Napoleon came closer to success than might be supposed given his difficult situation, but the strategic context made his ultimate defeat highly probable. In the days following the Battle of Waterloo, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, Napoleon returned to Paris facing the collapse of his restored empire and the necessity of deciding what to do in the face of inevitable coalition victory. The French army that had fought at Waterloo was shattered, incapable of further organized resistance. Coalition armies were advancing into France from multiple directions with overwhelming force that could not be stopped by whatever troops Napoleon might gather. And political support for Napoleon's rule was evaporating as French military and civilian leaders recognized that continued resistance would only bring more suffering without changing the ultimate outcome. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21, 3 days after the battle, and found a city uncertain and divided about what should happen next. Some voices argued that Napoleon should declare himself dictator, suspend constitutional niceties, and mobilize France for total war against the coalition. Others argued that Napoleon should abdicate in favor of his son, allowing the Napoleonic dynasty to continue under a regency while Napoleon himself departed to allow peace negotiations to proceed. Still others argued that only complete abandonment of the Bonaparte dynasty would satisfy the coalition and allow France to achieve peace on acceptable terms. The Chamber of Deputies and the Chamber of Peers, the legislative bodies created under Napoleon's Additional Act, debated these options while effectively pressuring Napoleon to abdicate. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time, this time without conditions beyond expressing hope that his son might be recognized as his successor. But the coalition powers would not accept a Napoleonic succession even under a regency, and the provisional government that took power in Paris immediately began negotiating with the coalition for terms that would restore the Bourbon monarchy and that would define France's relationship with the victorious powers. Napoleon remained in Paris briefly, considering various possibilities for his personal future, including potentially escaping to America where he might find refuge and where his presence would not threaten European political stability. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine Napoleon in these final days of his political career, stripped of power but not yet imprisoned or exiled, considering options that all led away from Europe and from the grand stage where he had performed for 2 decades. His initial thought was to reach the French coast and to board a ship for America, where the United States might offer asylum or at least not immediately turn him over to the coalition powers. He left Paris on June 29 and traveled west toward the port of Rochefort on the Atlantic coast, accompanied by a small group of loyal followers. But reaching America proved impossible. British naval forces were blockading French ports, and any vessel attempting to carry Napoleon across the Atlantic would be intercepted by British ships that had orders to capture Napoleon and to prevent his escape. Napoleon lingered at Rochefort for several days, considering whether to attempt the crossing despite the blockade, whether to hide in France and hope that the coalition occupation would eventually end allowing him to emerge, or whether to surrender to the British and trust in British magnanimity to provide him with honorable treatment. On July 15, Napoleon boarded HMS Bellerophon, a British warship, and formally surrendered to the British captain, declaring that he came to place himself under the protection of British laws and to seek asylum in Britain. This surrender was partly calculation and partly desperation. Napoleon believed that Britain, as a nation that prided itself on law and liberty, might treat him honorably and might allow him to live in Britain as a private person, perhaps under some form of house arrest but with reasonable comfort and dignity. He apparently hoped that British public opinion, which had sometimes expressed grudging admiration for his abilities even while opposing his power, might support treating him well rather than incarcerating him harshly. But the British government had no intention of allowing Napoleon to reside in Britain where his presence might create political complications or where he might become a focus for dissent and opposition to the government. The decision about Napoleon's fate was made quickly at the highest levels of British government in consultation with the coalition allies. Napoleon would be sent into exile at Saint Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic Ocean more than 1,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass and more than 4,000 miles from Europe. This location was chosen specifically because escape would be virtually impossible and because Napoleon would be completely isolated from European affairs, unable to influence events or to serve as a rallying point for opposition to the restored Bourbon monarchy or to the post-war European order. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense the finality of this decision. Napoleon's first exile to Elba had been relatively comfortable and had been close enough to Europe that escape and return proved possible. His second exile would be permanent, uncomfortable, and utterly remote from the world where he had achieved such remarkable success. The man who had dominated Europe and who had seemed at times almost superhuman in his abilities and achievements would spend his remaining years confined to a small island in the South Atlantic, far from France, far from his family, far from the contests of power and glory that had defined his life. Napoleon spent the voyage to Saint Helena on British warships, arriving at the island in October 1815. He would live there for nearly 6 years until his death in May 1821. The conditions of his confinement were restrictive, with British officials monitoring his activities, limiting his movements, and controlling his communications. He lived with a small household of loyal followers who had chosen to accompany him into exile, and he spent his time writing memoirs, dictating recollections of his campaigns and his rule, refighting his battles in conversation, and gradually declining in health due to the island's climate and possibly to disease. The exile on Saint Helena allowed Napoleon to shape how history would remember him. His memoirs and the recollections of those who were with him presented his career in the most favorable light, emphasizing his administrative achievements and military brilliance while minimizing the suffering that his wars had caused and the autocratic nature of his rule. These accounts would influence historical interpretations for generations, creating the Napoleonic legend that portrayed him as a genius and as a champion of revolutionary principles who had been brought down by the reactionary monarchies of Europe. The reality was more complex, but Napoleon's own narrative proved powerful and enduring. The coalition powers' decision to exile Napoleon to Saint Helena permanently and to refuse any possibility of his return to Europe or to France was motivated by hard experience. They had defeated Napoleon in 1814 and had exiled him to Elba, only to see him return and plunge Europe into renewed warfare during the 100 Days. They would not make the same mistake twice. Saint Helena offered security that Elba had not, and Napoleon's permanent removal was necessary for the coalition powers to feel confident that the peace they were creating would endure. With Napoleon's final defeat and permanent exile assured, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, the coalition powers turned to the question of what peace terms to impose on France and how to reconstruct European order in ways that would prevent future French aggression while also allowing France to be reintegrated into European diplomatic society. The Second Treaty of Paris, negotiated in the autumn of 1815 and signed in November, reflected the tension between the desire to punish France for Napoleon's return and the 100 Days, and the recognition that overly harsh terms would create resentment and instability that might lead to future conflicts. The The Second Treaty of Paris was considerably harsher than the first treaty that had been negotiated in May 1814 after Napoleon's first abdication. The territorial terms reduced France to its 1790 borders, slightly smaller than the 1792 borders that had been accepted in the first treaty. This meant that France lost some additional territories, particularly in eastern France along the borders with Germany and Switzerland. These territorial losses, while not enormous, represented a symbolic reduction in French power and a tangible consequence of Napoleon's return and the renewed warfare it had caused. More significantly, the Second Treaty imposed a substantial indemnity on France of 700 million francs to be paid to the coalition powers as compensation for the costs of military operations during the 100 Days. This indemnity represented a significant financial burden on France, though the amount was not so large as to be economically crippling, and payment schedules were arranged in ways that France could manage. The treaty also required France to return art treasures and cultural objects that had been taken from other countries during Napoleonic conquests, reversing one of the cultural consequences of French military success and restoring to various European nations artifacts that had been removed during the wars. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the occupation provisions that the Second Treaty imposed. Coalition military forces would occupy northern and eastern France for a period of 3 to 5 years, with the costs of this occupation to be borne by France. The occupation was designed to ensure French compliance with treaty terms and to provide security against any possibility of renewed French aggression. Occupation forces would total approximately 150,000 men drawn from Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and British contingents, creating a substantial foreign military presence on French soil. The occupation would be commanded by the Duke of Wellington, whose victory at Waterloo gave him enormous prestige and whose reputation for fairness and competence made him acceptable to both the coalition powers and to France. Despite these harsher terms compared to the first treaty, the Second Treaty of Paris was still relatively moderate compared to what the coalition might have imposed on a defeated aggressor that had violated its earlier peace agreement and had plunged Europe into renewed war. France was not dismembered or permanently weakened as a great power. The Bourbon monarchy was restored again, with Louis XVIII returning to Paris and resuming his throne, but the French political system retained some constitutional elements, including representative institutions that limited absolute royal power. France was excluded from the Congress of Vienna's final deliberations and from the immediate European diplomatic councils, but it was understood that France would eventually be reintegrated into European diplomatic society once it had demonstrated commitment to the peace settlement. Several factors explain the relative moderation of the Second Treaty of Paris. The coalition powers, particularly Britain and Austria, recognized that France remained an important European power with a large population, substantial economic resources, and a strategic location that made it relevant to European balance of power calculations. Destroying or permanently weakening France would create power vacuums that other powers might fill in ways that could destabilize Europe. The treaty negotiations were also influenced by statesmen including Castlereagh and Metternich, who understood that stable peace required accommodation and integration rather than vengeance and humiliation. The Bourbon Restoration under Louis XVIII was accepted by the coalition as the most practical way to provide France with a government that would respect the peace settlement and that would not threaten European stability. Louis XVIII's earlier rule in 1814 had shown that he could govern relatively moderately and that he understood the necessity of accepting some revolutionary and Napoleonic reforms that had become embedded in French society. The constitutional charter that Louis XVIII had granted in 1814 and that would be revised slightly after his second restoration provided a framework for limited monarchical government that balanced royal authority with representative institutions and protection of civil liberties. As you rest, the territorial settlement created by the Congress was extraordinarily complex, involving adjustments to borders and sovereignties across the entire European continent from Italy to Scandinavia, from Portugal to Poland. Some of the major elements have already been mentioned, including the creation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands combining the former Dutch Republic with Belgium, the reorganization of Germany into the German Confederation of 39 states with Austria and Prussia as the dominant powers, and the consolidation of Russian control over most of Poland. But the settlement also addressed countless smaller territorial issues, including the restoration of Piedmont Sardinia as a kingdom in northwestern Italy serving as a barrier to potential French expansion, the Austrian acquisition of Lombardy and Venice in northern Italy, and the restoration of various smaller German principalities and Italian states. The principle of legitimacy that guided much of the Congress's work led to restoration of many traditional monarchies that had been displaced by French conquest or Napoleonic reorganization. But legitimacy was not applied absolutely, as the Congress also recognized that some territorial changes were necessary for strategic reasons and for creating effective balance of power. The accommodation between legitimacy and practical power considerations produced a settlement that combined restoration of traditional dynasties with territorial adjustments designed to create stable frontiers and to position strong states as barriers against potential aggression. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine how the Congress addressed the question of how to prevent future revolutions or nationalist movements that might destabilize the order it was creating. The conservative political philosophy that dominated the Congress held that revolutionary movements were dangerous disruptions to legitimate authority and to social order, and that they should be suppressed through cooperation among monarchical powers. This led to agreements that the major powers would consult and potentially intervene to suppress revolutions in countries where legitimate monarchies were threatened by revolutionary movements or liberal reforms. This conservative approach would face challenges over subsequent decades as nationalism and liberalism proved to be powerful forces in European society. The revolutions of 1830, including the July Revolution in France that replaced the Bourbon monarchy with the more liberal July monarchy, and the Belgian Revolution that created an independent Belgium separate from the Netherlands, demonstrated that the Vienna settlement could not permanently freeze European political development. The revolutions of 1848 that swept across much of Europe represented an even more serious challenge, though the ultimate suppression of most of these revolutionary movements showed that the conservative order retained significant strength. The Congress of Vienna also attempted to address certain humanitarian and social issues, including the slave trade, which Britain in particular sought to abolish through international agreement. The Congress's final act included a declaration condemning the slave trade, though it did not establish effective enforcement mechanisms, and many countries continued involvement in slavery for decades. The Congress also addressed questions about navigation rights on international rivers including the Rhine, establishing principles that would facilitate commerce and reduce potential conflicts over control of these economically important waterways. The Concert of Europe that emerged from the Vienna settlement created a diplomatic framework for managing European affairs through regular conferences and consultations among the major powers. This system was not a formal international organization with permanent institutions, but rather an understanding among the powers that they would meet periodically to address major issues, that they would coordinate their policies, and that they would work together to maintain the settlement that the Congress had created. The concert proved flexible and adaptive, evolving over time as circumstances changed and as new issues emerged that required collective attention. The Congress of Vienna's settlement has been subject to extensive historical analysis and debate. Supporters argue that it created nearly a century of relative peace in Europe, preventing general European war until World War I, and that it provided a framework for managing international relations that balanced competing interests effectively. Critics argue that the Congress's conservative orientation suppressed legitimate aspirations for national self-determination and liberal reform, that it sacrificed the interests of smaller peoples to great power convenience, and that it ultimately failed to address emerging forces of nationalism and industrialization that would eventually undermine the order it created. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate that the Vienna settlement was neither simply good nor simply bad, but rather a product of its time, reflecting the beliefs and interests of the statesmen who created it. It did achieve its primary objective of preventing French hegemony and creating a stable balance of power that lasted for decades. It did reintegrate France into European diplomatic society relatively quickly, demonstrating that even defeated aggressors could be accommodated if they accepted the basic principles of the international order. And it did create mechanisms for great power cooperation that helped prevent the kind of hegemonic warfare that had characterized the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. But the settlement also had limitations and failures. It could not permanently suppress nationalism or liberal political movements, which grew stronger throughout the 19th century and which eventually led to the unification of Germany and Italy, events that transformed the European balance of power in ways the Vienna settlement had not anticipated. It could not prevent the Crimean War or various other conflicts that disrupted European peace, even while not escalating to general continental warfare. And its conservative orientation sometimes led the major powers to support repressive policies and to oppose legitimate reforms, creating resentments that stored up problems for the future. The comparison between the Congress of Vienna's settlement after the Napoleonic Wars and the Treaty of Versailles after World War I reveals the importance of how defeated powers are treated and how peace settlements are structured. The Vienna settlement, while imposing costs on France, did not attempt to permanently weaken France or to humiliate it, and it created a framework for reintegrating France into European diplomacy. The Treaty of Versailles, by contrast, imposed harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations, territorial losses, military restrictions, and a war guilt clause that many Germans found humiliating. The contrast between the relative stability of the post-Vienna 19th century and the instability of the interwar 20th century that led to World War II suggests that moderation in peace settlements and accommodation of defeated powers' legitimate interests produces more durable results than punitive approaches. As we approach the conclusion of this story about Napoleon's fall and about how Europe reorganized itself after more than 2 decades of revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval, as you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, let me reflect with you on Napoleon's complex legacy and on how his career and the wars that bore his name transformed European politics, military affairs, and society in ways that would shape the modern world. Napoleon Bonaparte died on Saint Helena on May 5, 1821, nearly 6 years after his final defeat at Waterloo. The official cause of death was recorded as stomach cancer, though the diagnosis was uncertain given the medical knowledge of the time, and various theories about the cause of his death have been proposed over the years. He was buried on Saint Helena according to his wishes, though his remains would be returned to France in 1840 and interred in the tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, where they remain today. His death at the age of 51 ended a life that had been extraordinarily active and consequential, a life that had risen from relative obscurity in provincial Corsica to domination of continental Europe and then fallen back to isolated imprisonment on a remote island in the South Atlantic. The immediate legacy of Napoleon's fall was the restoration of monarchical and conservative order across Europe under the Vienna settlement. The revolutionary principles that revolutionary France had championed and that Napoleon had spread across Europe through conquest were officially rejected, and traditional monarchies were restored to their thrones. But this restoration could not completely reverse the changes that had occurred during the revolutionary and Napoleonic period, and many reforms that had been implemented under French rule were retained even after Napoleon's fall because they had proven effective and because reverting to earlier systems was impractical. The Napoleonic Code, the comprehensive legal code that Napoleon had created for France and had imposed in conquered territories, became the foundation for civil law systems across much of continental Europe and Latin America. The code provided clear, rational legal principles covering property rights, contracts, family relations, and civil procedures, replacing complex customary law and feudal legal traditions with modern legal concepts based on equality before the law and protection of individual rights. Even countries that opposed Napoleon militarily often adopted legal codes modeled on the Napoleonic Code because they recognized its superiority to their existing legal systems. As you breathe slowly and let yourself sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can appreciate how Napoleon's administrative reforms also had lasting influence. The prefectural system that Napoleon created for France, with appointed officials called prefects administering departments under central government supervision, proved more efficient than the more decentralized and chaotic systems that had preceded it. The emphasis on rational organization, on merit-based selection of officials, on uniform procedures across territories, and on effective tax collection and public services became models that other European governments emulated. The modern bureaucratic state owes much to Napoleonic innovations in administration. Military institutions and practices were permanently changed by the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's innovations in military organization, including the corps system that allowed large armies to move in separate columns but to concentrate rapidly for battle, his emphasis on speed and mobility, his use of artillery and his integration of different military arms, and his understanding of logistics and supply all became standard practices studied in military academies and implemented by armies across Europe and beyond. The mass armies created through conscription during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods represented a fundamental change from the smaller professional armies of the 18th century, and mass mobilization of national populations for war would remain a feature of modern warfare. The Napoleonic Wars also accelerated nationalism as a political force in Europe. The experience of French occupation and domination stimulated national consciousness in Germany, Italy, Spain, and other countries where peoples developed stronger sense of national identity, partly in opposition to French rule. German nationalism in particular was strengthened by the wars of liberation against Napoleon in 1813 and 1814, creating a foundation for the eventual German unification under Prussian leadership in 1870. Italian nationalism similarly drew inspiration from the Napoleonic period, both from the experience of unified administration under French rule and from the desire to achieve independence from foreign domination. The question of whether Napoleon should be understood as a champion of revolutionary principles or as a betrayer of those principles has been debated since his own lifetime. His supporters emphasize his role in spreading revolutionary reforms including legal equality, abolition of feudalism, religious toleration, and merit-based advancement across Europe. They point to his administrative and legal achievements, to his support for education and rational government, and to his role in modernizing societies that had been dominated by feudal traditions. His critics emphasize his authoritarian rule, his suppression of political freedom, his wars that caused immense suffering, and his personal ambition that sacrificed republican ideals for imperial glory. Both assessments contain truth. Napoleon was a product of the French Revolution who rose to power through revolutionary institutions and who benefited from revolutionary principles of careers open to talent. He did implement many revolutionary reforms and did spread them across Europe, creating lasting changes in law, administration, and social organization. But he also concentrated power in his own hands, established a new monarchy and a new aristocracy, suppressed political opposition and press freedom, and waged aggressive wars primarily to serve his own ambitions. The relationship between Napoleon and the Revolution was complex, with Napoleon both extending and betraying revolutionary ideals. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can reflect on how Napoleon's career illuminates fundamental questions about power, about leadership, about the relationship between individual ability and historical circumstances, and about the costs and benefits of revolutionary change. Napoleon's remarkable rise demonstrated that individual talent and determination could indeed reshape history, that one person with sufficient ability and ambition in the right circumstances could transform political and military situations and could dominate an entire continent. But his ultimate fall demonstrated the limits of individual power, showing that no individual, however talented, could indefinitely overcome the collective resistance of determined opponents with superior resources. The wars that bore Napoleon's name revealed patterns about international relations that remain relevant. They showed that hegemonic efforts by one power to dominate others, generate resistance that eventually coalesces into overwhelming force. They demonstrated that alliances and coalitions, though difficult to maintain and coordinate, can achieve what individual powers cannot. They illustrated that military genius and tactical brilliance, while important, cannot indefinitely overcome fundamental disparities in resources and population. And they proved that lasting peace requires accommodation and balance rather than domination and subjugation. The human costs of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were enormous, with military casualties numbering in the millions and civilian populations suffering from military operations, occupation, economic disruption, and all the ways that total war affects societies. Entire regions were devastated, and some areas took decades to recover fully from the destruction. The memory of these costs contributed to the relatively peaceful 19th century that followed the Vienna settlement, as European leaders and populations retained vivid memories of what war could do and were consequently more cautious about embarking on aggressive policies or allowing conflicts to escalate to general warfare. Napoleon's personal fate, dying in isolation on Saint Helena far from France and from the European stage where he had achieved such remarkable success, has invited philosophical reflection about the relationship between power and happiness, about the price of ambition, and about the impermanence of worldly glory. The man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, who had dictated to emperors and kings, who had redrawn the map of Europe, ended his life confined to a small island, his health failing, his empire gone, his legacy contested. This trajectory from extraordinary power to complete powerlessness has made Napoleon's story a subject of endless fascination, inspiring literature, art, and historical study that attempts to understand both his achievements and his ultimate failure. Sleep peacefully now, dear friend, knowing that the story of Napoleon's fall and of Europe's reorganization after his defeat is a story about how societies recover from upheaval, about how international orders are constructed and maintained, about how the ambitions of individuals must ultimately accommodate the interests and resistance of others. The Napoleonic era reshaped Europe fundamentally, spreading revolutionary principles and modern administrative practices, stimulating nationalism, transforming warfare, and demonstrating both the possibilities and the limits of individual power. Rest now in the knowledge that you have journeyed through one of history's most dramatic episodes, that you have witnessed the fall of a remarkable man who had risen higher than perhaps any individual before him and who fell further, that you have seen how Europe responded to years of upheaval by creating institutions and settlements designed to prevent recurrence of such destructive conflicts. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, but tonight there is only peace, only rest, only the gentle embrace of sleep. The wars are long over, Napoleon is nearly 2 centuries in his grave, Europe has moved far beyond the conflicts that once consumed it, and the Vienna settlement that seemed so important has itself been superseded by later developments. Sleep well, dear friend, in the quiet knowledge that all human achievements and all human empires eventually pass into history, becoming subjects for reflection and study rather than immediate concerns, teaching us about power and pride, about hubris and nemesis, about how the mighty fall and how societies endure and rebuild after even the most devastating upheavals.